I didn't stop loving him. I stopped explaining myself. And in 24 hours, everything collapsed. Not because I left, not because I yelled, not because I did anything dramatic, but because I stopped explaining my choices, stopped justifying my decisions, stopped defending my preferences, stopped seeking his approval for things that didn't require it. Just stopped. And the silence, my refusal to perform the expected explanation, broke everything. I'd spent 6 years constantly explaining why I'd made the choice. I made why I'd said what I'd said, why I'd gone where I'd gone, why I needed what I needed, explaining. Until he was satisfied, until he understood, until he approved. The explaining was the glue that held the relationship together, was my job, my role, my constant performance, and the day I stopped performing it, the entire system revealed itself as built entirely on my willingness to justify my existence. I'm 51, I left 3 years ago, and that day, the day I stopped explaining, was the beginning of the end, was the moment I finally saw that the relationship wasn't partnership, wasn't mutual respect, was built entirely on my constant justification. That's when I learned explanation wasn't love. It was compliance. If you've ever spent hours explaining a simple decision, if you've justified choices that didn't require justification, if you've defended your right to have preferences, to make plans, to exist autonomously, if you've realized that someone expected constant explanation and your relationship couldn't survive without it, you already know what I'm describing. You already know the exhaustion of perpetual justification. And I'm realizing as I tell you this, some of you are explaining yourselves right now, constantly, exhaustingly. You're justifying simple choices, defending basic preferences, seeking approval for decisions that are yours to make. So here's what I need to know. What are you tired of explaining? Just drop one thing in the comments. I'm tired of explaining blank. Let's see if we're all justifying the same things. Because I spent 6 years thinking the explaining was normal, was what partnership required. I thought it was normal. I was wrong. Now let me tell you exactly what happened. It started with something so small I laughed when it happened. And that's exactly why it worked. We met when I was 45. He was 48, both divorced, both had adult children, both thought we knew what healthy relationship looked like. He seemed thoughtful, seemed interested in understanding me, asked a lot of questions, seemed to care about my reasoning, my thought process, my decision-making. I interpreted his questions as interest, as care, as genuine curiosity about who I was and how I thought. Didn't recognize until years later that the questions weren't curiosity. They were audits, were examinations, were ways of establishing that my choices required his understanding, his approval, his agreement before they were valid. Month 3, I made a decision, small decision, changed my hair, cut it shorter than I'd worn it in years. Came home from the salon feeling good, feeling confident. He looked at me, said, "You cut your hair?" I said, "Yes." I wanted a change. He said, "Why didn't you mention you were planning to do that?" I said, "I didn't think I needed to mention it. It's my hair." He said, "I'm not saying you need permission. I'm just surprised you didn't talk to me about it first. We usually discuss things." I felt immediately defensive, felt like I'd done something wrong, found myself explaining it was just a haircut. I saw a photo I liked, made an appointment. Didn't think it was something I needed to discuss. He said it's not about needing to discuss it. It's about partnership, about sharing your thoughts, about including me in your decisions. I apologized, said he was right. I should have mentioned it. Should have talked to him about it first. The apology established the pattern, established that my choices, even about my own body, were things I should explain, should discuss, should seek his input on before making. Year 1, the explaining expanded. I explained why I'd chosen the restaurant I'd chosen for dinner, why I'd bought the brand of coffee I'd bought, why I'd taken the route I'd taken driving home, why I'd called my mother when I'd called her, why I'd worn the outfit I'd worn. Every choice, every decision, every preference, all required explanation. All were subject to his questions, his need to understand my reasoning, his right to weigh in on whether my choice made sense, was the right choice, was what he would have chosen. I started explaining preemptively, would make a decision and immediately explain it. Here is what I chose, and here is why I chose it, and here is my reasoning, and here is why it makes sense. Trying to prevent the questions, prevent the examination, prevent the feeling that I'd done something wrong by making a choice without his input. The explaining became automatic, became my way of existing, became how I made decisions. Not just deciding, but preparing the explanation, preparing the defense, preparing the justification for why this choice, why this way, why not something else. Year 2, I noticed I couldn't make simple decisions without anxiety, couldn't choose a movie without worrying if he'd approve, couldn't buy groceries without mentally defending each item, couldn't make plans without preparing explanations for why these plans, why this timing, why these people. The anxiety wasn't about the decisions themselves. It was about the explaining I'd have to do, the justification I'd have to provide, the defense I'd have to mount if my choice wasn't what he would have chosen. That's when I understood the explaining wasn't communication. It was permission. I explained why I was tired, why I needed to rest, why I couldn't do something he wanted to do, explained with reasons, with justifications, with evidence that my tiredness was legitimate, was valid, was something he should understand and accept, couldn't just say. I'm tired, I need to rest, had to explain why, had to justify it, had to make a case for my own physical state, for my own needs, for my right to be tired without it being a problem. I explained my feelings, why I felt what I felt, why I was upset or happy or anxious or excited. Couldn't just feel, had to explain the feeling, justify it, make it make sense to him, prove it was a reasonable response to circumstances, prove I wasn't overreacting, wasn't being too sensitive, wasn't feeling things I shouldn't feel. My emotions required explanation, required his understanding, required his approval before they were valid. Year 3, my daughter noticed, said, "Mom, you explain everything to him. Every tiny decision comes with this long explanation. You never used to do that. You used to just decide things and do them. Now you're constantly justifying yourself." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You spent 10 minutes yesterday explaining why you debought the blue towels instead of the white ones. 10 minutes on towels. Why do you need to explain towels?" My daughter saw it clearly. I'd become someone who needed approval to buy towels. Her observation bothered me, stayed with me. I started noticing it, noticing how much time I spent explaining, justifying, defending choices that didn't require defense. Bought a book, explained why this book, why this author, why I now chose a movie, explained. Why this genre, why this actor, why tonight made plans with friends, explained which friends, why these friends, why this day, why this time. The explaining was constant, was exhausting, was taking more energy than the actual decisions. Year 4, I tried making decisions without explaining, small test, bought different brand of yogurt. He noticed, said, "This is different yogurt." I said, "Yes." He said, "Why'd you switch?" I said, "Just wanted to try something different." He said, "But you've been buying the other brand for months. What made you decide to switch?" I felt the familiar pressure. The expectation of explanation said, "I don't know." It just felt like a change. He said, "Okay, but that seems random. Usually you have a reason for changes." I found myself explaining anyway. The other brand was out of stock. This one was on sale. It's basically the same thing. Providing reasons, providing justification, unable to resist the pull to explain. Tried again, different test. Came home later than expected. He said, "You're late." I said, "Yes." He said, "What happened?" I said, "Just took longer than I thought." He said, "Longer how? What were you doing?" I said, "Just errands." Took more time than expected. He said, "What errands? Where did you go?" The questions kept coming, kept requiring answers, kept pulling explanation out of me. I gave in, listed the errands, explained the traffic, explained why each stop took longer than planned, provided the full accounting he seemed to need. Year 5, I realized I could not explain. The explaining was so ingrained, so automatic, so expected that resisting it felt wrong. It felt like I was hiding something, felt like I was being difficult, being uncommunicative, being a bad partner. The explaining had become my normal, had become what I believed partnership required, had become how I showed respect, consideration, inclusion. Couldn't imagine relating any other way. Month 67, something shifted. I was exhausted from work, from life, from the constant explaining. Made a decision, told a friend I'd help her move on Saturday. Didn't mention it to him, didn't explain it. Didn't seek his input, just made the plan. He found out Friday night, said you're helping Sarah move tomorrow. I said yes. He said, when were you planning to tell me? I said, I'm telling you now. He said, but you already made the plan. Already committed without discussing it with me. I said it didn't occur to me. I needed to discuss it. He said that's the problem. It should occur to you. We're partners. Partners discuss plans, include each other in decisions. I felt the familiar expectation, the pull to explain, to justify, to defend my choice, to walk him through my reasoning. But something in me resisted, said I made plans to help a friend. That's all. He said, but why didn't you check with me first? See if we had plans, see if I needed you for something. I said, did you have plans? Did you need me for something? He said, that's not the point. The point is you didn't check. I looked at him, saw the expectation in his face, the waiting, the assumption that I'd now explain, now justify, now walk through my reasoning and apologize for not including him and promise to do better next time. Saw the pattern so clearly in that moment, the pattern I'd been performing for years, and something in me just stopped, refused, said I'm helping Sarah move tomorrow. I'll be back in the evening. Didn't explain, didn't justify, didn't defend, just stated the fact and stopped talking. The silence that followed was louder than any argument we'd ever had. He stared at me waiting. I could see him waiting for the explanation that always came the justification. I always provided. I said nothing, just looked at him. The silence stretched, became uncomfortable, became charged. He said, that's it. That's all you're going to say. I said, what else is there to say? I made plans. I'm telling you the plans. He said, you're not going to explain why you didn't mention it sooner. Why you didn't check with me first. Why you committed without discussing it. I said, no, I'm not going to explain. It's my decision. I made it. He looked shocked, genuinely shocked, like I'd done something incomprehensible. Said, I don't understand where this is coming from, why you're being like this. This isn't like you. You always explain things. You always include me in your thinking. I said, maybe I'm tired of explaining every decision I make. Maybe some things don't require explanation. He said, partnership requires communication. Requires sharing your thought process, requires including each other. I said, I'm communicating. I'm telling you I have plans tomorrow. That is communication. What you're asking for isn't communication. It's justification, it's defense, it's approval seeking, and I'm not doing it anymore. The silence after that was different, was cold, was hostile. He walked away, didn't speak to me the rest of the night. The next morning, I left to help Sarah. He barely acknowledged me leaving. I spent the day helping her pack and move. Felt lighter than I'd felt in months. Felt free. Felt like myself. Came home that evening expecting him to have calmed down. Expecting we'd talk about it. Figure it out. He wasn't there. Texted him. No response. Called. No answer. He came home around 9. Went straight to bedroom. Closed the door. Sunday he was cold, distant, barely spoke. I tried to talk about it, said we need to discuss what happened Friday. He said there's nothing to discuss. You made it clear you don't value my input. Don't think you need to include me in your decisions. I said that's not what I said. I said I don't need to explain every choice I make. He said if you can't see the difference. I don't know what to tell you. Refused to engage further. The coldness continued Monday, Tuesday. Wednesday, the silent treatment, the withdrawal, the punishment for refusing to explain. By Thursday, I realized something fundamental. The relationship couldn't function without my constant explanation, my perpetual justification, my willingness to defend every choice. The explaining wasn't just something I did. It was the foundation, was the structure, was what held everything together. And without it, without my performance of that role, there was nothing, no actual partnership, no mutual respect, no trust, just the expectation that I would explain and the collapse when I didn't. The relationship couldn't survive my autonomy. That told me everything. Friday evening, 1 week after I'd stopped explaining, I told him we needed to talk. He said, I've been waiting for you to apologize, to acknowledge that you were wrong, that you should have discussed your plans, should have included me. I said, I'm not going to apologize for making plans with a friend. He said, then we have a problem. I said, we do have a problem. The problem is you expect me to justify every decision I make, to seek your approval for choices that are mine to make, to perform constant explanation as if I need permission to exist autonomously. He said, that's what partnership is. That's what it means to be in a relationship, to consider the other person, to include them, to communicate. I said, communicating isn't the same as justifying, informing you of my plans, isn't the same as seeking permission for them. I'm allowed to make decisions without explaining my entire thought process. I'm allowed to have autonomy without constant accountability. He said, if that's what you believe, if you think you can just make decisions without considering me, then maybe this isn't going to work. I said, maybe it's not. Maybe a relationship that falls apart when I stop explaining myself was never built on solid ground to begin with. Maybe the fact that you can't handle me making one decision without justifying it to you reveals something about what this relationship actually is. He said, I can't believe you're doing this. Can't believe you're throwing away 6 years over helping someone move. I said, I'm not throwing it away over helping someone move. I'm ending it because the relationship can't survive me having autonomy, can't survive me making choices without constant explanation, and that's not partnership, that's control. Month 68, I moved out. The explaining had stopped, and with it the entire relationship structure, everything that had seemed solid, seemed established, seemed like partnership, all of it revealed as built entirely on my performance, my justification, my constant accountability. Without my explaining, everything collapsed because there was nothing underneath, no actual connection, no genuine respect, just the expectation that I would explain, and the relationship that existed only as long as I did. 3 years out, I make decisions without explaining them, without justifying them, without defending them. The freedom is still strange, still feels unfamiliar. I catch myself starting to explain simple choices, starting to justify basic decisions, have to stop myself, remind myself that I don't owe anyone an explanation for how I live my life. For the choices I make, for the preferences I have, the right person won't require constant justification, won't need me to defend my autonomy, won't expect explanation for every decision. I'm learning that healthy relationships include communication, include sharing, include consideration, but don't require constant explanation, constant justification, constant defensive choices. Don't require me to seek approval for decisions that are mine to make. Don't require me to perform perpetual accountability as if my autonomy is something I have to earn, something I have to justify, something that requires his understanding before it's valid. Here's what I desperately wish someone had told me the first time I explained my haircut. The first time I justified a simple decision. If someone requires constant explanation, if they need to understand and approve every choice you make, if your decisions require their agreement before they're valid, you're not in a partnership. You're in a dynamic where your autonomy is conditional, where your right to make choices depends on your ability to justify them, and that's not respect. That's not consideration. That's control disguised as communication. If you're reading this and you're constantly explaining yourself, constantly justifying simple decisions, constantly defending choices that shouldn't require defense, if you're exhausted from perpetual explanation, If you can't make a decision without anxiety about how you'll justify it, if you've realized someone expects constant accountability for your autonomy, you don't owe that. You don't owe anyone an explanation for living your life, for making your choices, for existing as a separate person with your own thoughts and preferences and decisions. If this resonated, if you've discovered that someone requires constant explanation, the next video is crucial. It's called You Weren't Controlled. You Were Managing His Mood. It's about what happens when you realize you weren't being controlled in obvious ways, weren't being told what to do, but you were constantly managing his emotional state, constantly monitoring his mood, constantly adjusting your behavior to maintain his comfort. That management, that constant emotional labor, that hypervigilance about his feelings, that's control too, just invisible control. Control that looks like care. Link is on screen now.